Today's topic is going to be around running effective discovery to make sure that as a startup founder or serial entrepreneur, your software product is successful on the marketplace. Shoukri, I'm just curious, how would you define product discovery for a typical startup?
So I I I would start by calling this problem discovery. What you're doing is talking to potential prospects and you're trying to understand their worldview, like what's going on in their world, in their mind at this moment that you're talking to them, in that kind of month, in that year. And this kind of framing is important because a lot of people think that a market is something that is static, but the market is something that is ever evolving. When your goal is to sell into a role, you need to understand the person behind the role. Need to understand what is going on in that person's life, because at the end of the day, you're going to be selling to a person. And that person, you're getting a snapshot of him in space and in time. So you're kind of thinking, what is screaming at them right now? What are the top problems? And why this is important? Because if you're trying to build an app or a software or a solution or a product, ideally, you want this product to be solving some of the top pain points that this prospect has. Otherwise, you're building a nice to have. If my favorite example will be think of the sense of urgency that you have to get your teeth cleaned versus you have a cavity. And so you can put off going to, get your teeth cleaned for months and not do it, and you can probably drag it for years. And there's no sense of urgency versus you have a cavity, you're in pain, and just like right now, I want this solved. Like I'm gonna go to the doctor, I'm gonna pay how much it takes, and I just have to do it because it's like super duper urgent. And this is the kind of urgency you want in the market around the problem you're trying to solve. And what this allows you to do, this allows you to sell easily, to convince easily, to have people hand you the money. If it's not a painful problem, no one is going to hand you the money, because I have, if I have to decide how do I allocate my money, because also money is not infinite, and my time as an executive in the B2B SaaS, but you can generalize this to, to the consumer side. But if I'm a B2B executive that's spending 50% of my day dealing with one specific problem, you trying to sell me on another, on a minor thing is just like useless. It's a waste of time. I'm not going to be giving this, as an executive, I'm not going to be giving this the time and attention it needs. I'm going to share a story here because I remember one meeting I had. This is kind of from one of the startups. So for one of the startups I had, I was essentially trying to sell into a B2B account. This was a startup that I started myself. I was the CEO and the CTO. So I went to sell, and I was also kind of building the product. And I remember a meeting I had with an executive. So essentially, I was in an executive office. It was an in-person meeting. I demoed my software that I built, and I could tell that the executive was getting impatient with me. And so I keep yapping and I keep talking about, but this is great. Look at all of these features. Look at the stuff. And I'm, selling and selling and selling. And he's like, stop. I have 99 problem right now. whatever you're selling me or whatever you're offering me doesn't solve any of them. And that's when it hit me that if you don't have that, like if that executive is spending 90% of his time focused on one metric or one objective, and the company has certain mandates, has certain objectives, and so if whatever you have to offer is not high up on that rung list, then your project, your product, whatever you have to offer is just not going to be met with urgency, which means you're going to be chasing this thing for a very long, long time. And the probability of you closing that B2B account or that deal is slim to none because you don't have that kind of sense of urgency. And so in discovery, to tie this back to discovery, your goal first is to talk to customers. In fact, it is to come up with theories who potential customers for my product are, and trying to find segmentation in that market and trying to find an audience that have a sense of urgency around the problem that you're solving.
And in that case, how much time does a startup want to spend in the discovery stage? Or is that something that's ongoing as they're building?
It is something that is ongoing as you're building. But first, I think when you're starting, there is a phase when you're doing discovery when you have no product. And that's actually the right way to do it, is to start that discovery process before you have a product, before you have an offering on the market, and do it with enough volume. And I think you can equate time to volume, but that's not always the case. So if I think about a market, right, any market that I'm going to sell into, the question becomes, how many people do I have to talk to for me to establish if there is an opportunity here or not? And so I think I like to frame this from a volume perspective as opposed to time elapsed perspective, because if you only have one conversation with the customer a day, this could be 90 days, right? And because I think you need a representative sample of your market, and I think that should be quantified with numbers. Just you should put a number, and I think this is where now you're kind of taking us in an interesting avenue, because one of the things that I would like to explore together is the idea that there is no go-to-market process, or there's sort of kind of mystique around taking a startup to market. There's a bit of a mystery there. Founders do not understand this part well, that in technology, in software, when you write software, there is a mature process. So there is like Agile, there's Scrum, there's Kanban, there's so many methodologies that talk about how you deliver a software project or a software product. But what is not known is that there is similarly a methodology, or I would say, in fact, it's something that I think we're coming up with. I don't think there is a mature framework or methodology for how you can take an idea to market. And I think part of what makes a methodology valuable is to have numbers around that, is to have numbers and have metrics that to say, I think a lot of startup founders might think of the go-to-market and the marketing thing as just like and I certainly had that kind of misconception myself, is that I used to think that the go-to-market it's this kind of tricky, fuzzy process where you're just like spraying and praying. And I started to understand it's not. You can turn it into a methodology if you apply some discipline around it. And so essentially you can quantify it with numbers. And an easy number to measure is how many conversations I'm having. Now, it's, you know, you could argue with me it's not just about the number of conversations, it's about the quality of the conversation too. And I'd love to dive into what makes a quality discovery conversation, because I've seen and I've been part of conversations, discovery conversations that were extremely not productive.
Is there a golden number for the number of conversations that one should have before going to
The
market?
more the better, but I'm gonna throw a scary number and say 100.
100 conversations with ideal customer profile roles on digging pain and going deep into how you should position your product in
Yes,
the
but
market.
I want to also think, and I also want to encourage that these have to be. Uh, so let's say we go with that kind of 100 number. If there is a lot of fragmentation in your niche, or there is many, like if this is a very wide market, 100 conversations might not be enough. You want 100 conversations in a sub market. Or let's say if I have 4 ICPs, I think I think I want 100 conversations for one ICP, and then the second, and then the second, and the second. And maybe if this is an extreme number, you start with 20, 20, 20, 20. So if you have 4 ICPs that you think want your product, you don't want to be having like 4 conversations, and the 4 conversations are just the 4 different ICPs, because you've learned nothing, right? So if I only, if I have 4 ICPs, and I'm just going to talk to one guy in this niche and one lady in this niche and another in this one and another in this one, I haven't really learned anything valuable. So you need volume within that single ICP to really understand what's going on in that market, right? One way to think of an ICP, because I think people watching and listening might not grasp this piece.
Generation. The way I think of ICP is by turning on a sufficient amount of filters within data sets like Apollo, Sales Navigator, ZoomInfo, Cognizant, etc.
But I think we
Um,
need to describe, because a lot, I think if somebody's familiar with Sales Navigator, for example, LinkedIn Sales Navigator, or if somebody
mhm.
have ever kind of tried to run an ad on Meta or on X or any other platform, they'll have a much better grasp of what an ICP is. But I think we need to describe that to somebody who's never seen a Sales Navigator. So if you think about, and maybe we actually cut this video and we kind of show Sales Navigator. We do a screen sharing and we kind of show Sales Navigator. And actually, you know what? Do you want to do this now?
We could do that, or I could just list some of the
Oh yeah.
filters that I would think about when trying to create the ideal customer profile. Because the way you and I do it is we have actually an Excel file with 4 different personas of the different people that we try to engage. We consider where they're at geographically. We're considering the company headcount. Is it startup founders with less than 20 people on board? Or is it serial entrepreneurs with at least 50 to 500 employees with previous exits and successful startups that they've launched? What is their job title? Are they the founder? Are they the chief marketing officer? Who are they? And in what industry? In what niche? And then to add to that, I will also add additional keywords into Sales Navigator. So, for example, if I'm looking in the subsect of financial services, um, that being the industry category within Sales Navigator, if I'm looking for crypto companies, I might add crypto, Web3, fintech into the keyword search to go into the sub niche of that industry. And that will give me a pretty detailed ICP of, let's say, founders with
Yeah.
crypto companies.
Yeah, I love that. And so a way to kind of summarize this is if you think there's a niche called founders, but that's a very huge niche, right? And there's a ton of founders in different types of businesses. And then under founders, now you go into SaaS founders. And then under SaaS founders, you can have B2B SaaS founders. And then you can go into AI tools. And then under AI tools, there's like medical AI tools. And then there is, fintech AI tools. And it's all of that. That's kind of what constitutes a niche. And these are the kind of experiments that, as part of discovery, you're trying to tease out in the broad market sub niches that are underserved and that have a severe burning hair on fire kind of problem.
And ideally, you reach out to them and have those conversations in order to define your product. Because if, let's say, you're speaking to someone without pain, in sales methodologies, there's the difference between the champion versus the decision maker. Decision maker perhaps might be the CEO, but he doesn't necessarily have the problem. And sometimes where you have to start is at the champion level. So, for example, in one of the companies I was at called Optimi, we would reach out to like um, corporate social responsibility coordinators because they're the ones with the burning pain of not being able to manage their grants effectively, whereas the CEO was the one approving on it. And the reason why we wouldn't reach out to the CEO first, even though he makes the decision, is because he's not the one with pain. So he's not going to care unless it's pushed internally within the organization, which is why we started at the champion level.
And you're bringing up another interesting point that, uh, and this is why you want to do discovery is how many people are involved in that deal or in that sale, right? Ideally, when you're as a startup and if you're, especially if you're kind of in the early days, if you go after a niche that you have 6 or 8 stakeholders to wrangle to get the sale happening, it's going to be extremely long sales cycle, and you want to be prepared for that. You want to know that ahead of time.
You briefly mentioned diving deeper into what makes a quality discovery conversation. Would you have like any questions in mind, or would you have any structure in mind as to what makes a quality discovery?
There's a big no-no. Never lead the witness, and I find this is the biggest mistake that I've seen in discoveries. If you find yourself talking about your product in discovery, you're doing it wrong. Discovery is not about your product. It's not about what you're trying to offer. It's really trying to understand the prospect and their pain points. And then eventually just trying to find if there's a fit between his pain points and what you have to offer. But your solution should not be part of that discovery conversation. Absolutely not part of a first discovery conversation. And so leading the witness is what we call it. It's that you come in and you're like, oh, I want to talk, here's what I have to offer. No, your goal is who are you? Who are you psychologically? You're trying to tease out also psychological profile of that person. Is he a risk averse? Is he a risk taker? Where is he in his career? Is he kind of close to retirement and thinking about, vacations, or is he actually trying to kind of climb up the corporate ladder? Understanding a person psychologically that way will allow you to sell to them at a much different level. And and yeah, what else? And then you're also now trying to understand the problems that they have and the sense of urgency around those problems. So if you walk out of a discovery and you haven't picked up on or you haven't understood the priorities of that executive or user you're talking to or customer that you're talking to or champion that you're talking to, you're doing it wrong.
A major tell to know whether or not you're talking too much or you're hogging too much of the conversation is the talk time. So that's why people usually pay big money for platforms like Gong. It's because they're able to coach you on something as important as discovery, or you can get something as simple as a free tool like Fathom to record your meeting and give you the talk time distribution. If you're talking more than 50% of the time as the person conducting discovery on a prospect, um, that's a big problem.
I'd argue
The
I'd argue you'll be talking
Go ahead.
10% of the time. Anything more, you're not learning anything.
Exactly. And you might be sharing a lot about your platform or about your services, and they might be asking you the questions, but then you have lost control of the conversation if they're the ones asking the question. Ideally, like I would argue that a golden ratio is 70-30, where you ask the questions and maybe add in a little bit after you've discovered enough. If they've shared some major pain points and you've dug well enough, and that's a skill set within itself to be able to dig that deep. But once you've dug deep enough, you can just give them snippets of information around how um, your product solves for that pain, just to intrigue them, but without selling them too much on it, and then moving on to the next question. So that way you're always maintaining flow.
The so one thing that Anatoly may be worth mentioning is that to conduct proper discovery, I would say as part of the kind of the intro, you say I'm not here to sell you anything. And so you shouldn't really try to work out anything around your product. Because if the premise is I'm not here to sell you anything, and you're trying to sell me actually midway through the conversation, I'll probably be pissed. I would if it's a first discovery call, I'm I'm not trying to sell the guy at all. In fact, I just want to hear their problems. And when you're really starting, you're not going to be good. So like you're not going to get that first sale. I think when you see the magic happen is when you finished your 10th discovery conversation and you now can read what the prospect is going to say without him saying it, and you can actually summarize it better than he does. Now you're able, like now you know them good enough, and now he wants to know, how come you know all of these things, and then now this flips into a natural like sales conversation, and naturally, and not something you force. And so, but why do you want to do that? Why do you want to not like you want to anchor that the discovery call is not a sales call? Because the moment I know that you're selling me something, there's like psychological guards that automatically come up. And the purpose of the discovery conversation to be loose and relaxed without me worrying that being open and vulnerable will give you an advantage to try to sell me or give you the ammunition to try to sell me. So that's why I would frame the discovery conversation as we're not here to sell anything, and you're not gonna try to sell them anything in that conversation. But you leave room open for a follow-up conversation. And then you can maybe make a pitch or something, but that's you finished the discovery call, and then you do this after.
I would argue it also depends on where they're at in the customer journey. Are they an inbound lead? Are they an outbound lead that you've gone in touch with just to have that initial conversation, or are they inbound and looking for a demo? Because if they're looking for a demo,
But that's not, but
they're
then
looking to
I'm
be
not going to
sold.
call this a discovery. So I think maybe Anatoly, there is maybe we need to clarify that a lot of consulting agencies and even B2B SaaS, they kind of call it discovery conversation. And to me, that's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about is what we call in the startup world problem discovery, where you're just focused on understanding a problem. So, and those by definition, they're all outbound. You're reaching out to people in the niche. I mean, can it be done inbound? I think that kind of discovery is very, very hard to be done inbound unless you really already understand the niche and you've developed content to bring them inbound. Those are 99% of the discoveries that I'm talking about are outbound. It's the only way to get them. It's you DMing people and saying, hey, and there's actually a couple of methods that we talk about, like how do you create value to have that conversation in the first place. And I think this is something that not a lot of entrepreneurs understand, because you can't reach out to someone and say, hey, I'm just going to waste 1 hour of your time and I have nothing to offer you back. And can I do that and then do that and say this is not a sales conversation? Then what is it? Right? So then there is a couple of approaches that you can do. One is, and I've seen many startups do this one, it's what they call, or you can call it like the report method or survey method, where I'm reaching out and saying, hey, I'm someone who is doing a survey or doing research on a, high level vague problem statement, and I'm reaching out to you as an expert in that industry. This is you reaching out to the prospect to say, I'm reaching out to you as an expert in this thing, and in exchange for this time, I might actually offer them like a gift card, or I might say, in exchange for this, I promise you, I'm going to give you the free report, and even this, there's like a lot of framing that you can go into. For example, the first discovery conversation is going to be hardest because then you have no social proof. But then maybe we'll help people with a concrete example. Let's say I'm going to be targeting, let's say I want to do discovery in HR industry. So, and I need to reach out to head of HR at B2B SaaS companies. Then what I will be doing is I'll be DMing the first B2B head of HR for company one and say, hey, I'm doing research on the top 3 pain points for head of HRs for 2024. And in exchange for this report, I'll offer you, $100 gift card. The guy says yes. You jump on that discovery call. The next time you want to ping someone, you say, hey, I'm reaching out to you as head of HR. And by the way, I've interviewed other head of HR at company A, and we're interviewing the industry leaders. So now you have social proof on discovery. And so you don't have to have a product, and you're just trying to sell them on having that conversation with you.
I like the research report one. Um, I I've had some success on LinkedIn reaching out to people, and many are interested in having that conversation without even needing a buy-in with a gift card. But that's also very effective to lead with the carrot. In regards to framing the conversation as this is not a
Mm,
sales conversation, I'm always very careful about that because um, it might seem disingenuous because the ultimate goal, my ultimate intent is to help them solve their pain point by selling them our solution. So to some, it might seem deceptive, and I
mm.
always have my guard up when a salesperson tells me I'm not here to sell you. It's like, man, like cut the crap. Like I know exactly what you're doing, but that's because I have a sales background, so I'm aware of these tactics. Um, as long as it's framed, I think in the right way of this specific conversation, I'm just
Mm.
looking to learn more about you. I think is can come off as genuine and
I
will
like it.
maintain
Yeah,
rapport.
I agree with you. I agree with you. Again, you want to frame it as on that conversation that I have nothing to sell you.
With the discovery process being the absolute foundation of every startup and every company, how does BitLab assist founders with that journey of discovery?
So we've established that we want you as a founder to do this discovery yourself. Can we do this discovery conversation on your behalf? Absolutely. We have the means, we have the capabilities, and we have the means to support you. However, we believe you need to be on that call with the prospect. And I know some founders who are not fans of these processes. When we started working with them, we kind of faced so much resistance that they. So I know some founders are not fans of kind of doing the discovery themselves, and they might be tempted to want to outsource it. However, I believe these discovery conversations are probably the highest ROI investment of your time as an early stage founder, because the the better you understand your customers and their psychology and what makes them tick, the better of a product that you can make for them, and the better your ability to sell to them.
And I find oftentimes, even during the process of our own discovery calls, we actually, before even digging into, or I would say after slightly digging into the pain points around development, because that's what's important to us, because that's the pain points that we can solve for, we actually ask questions around their biz dev side.
And and sometimes some entrepreneurs might find this too probing, but I believe to build the technology effectively, you need to understand the go-to-market strategy and how that product will go to market, because it shapes the roadmap, it shapes certain features, and it also shapes the technology roadmap. Like who your customer is impacts your product. And a crazy story that we can share there is, example of a startup that we worked with, and we designed a UI. We designed the UI UX of their. We had the it's so this is a startup in the logistics industry, and as part of the design process, they designed a kick-ass UI UX for their trucker app, and it was very beautiful, but it was extremely complex because it was designed with 20 to 30-year-olds in mind. However, what we discovered as we got in is that the average age of a truck driver is 55. So now you have a product, you've designed a beautiful app, except that a 20 to 30-year-old knows how to operate it, but a 55 has a heck of a time. So what do? You go and redesign and rework that UI UX and the experience. And this is an example where changing the demographic you're going after or changing the ICP you're going after means you're charge. If you change ICP, it means labels on your UI, labels on the screen might change, because the terminology that one ICP uses to describe something is different than the terminology another ICP uses. It also changes the features, because ICP1 and ICP2 might have different features, or the way the feature works could also be different. And then the tools that you use to go to market, and do you need to hook up a CRM, or do you need to hook up tracking pixels? These are things that are go to market related, but you need to embed them into the product, right? Like if you want to tracking and analytics, you want to know what analytics platform you want to target to install the proper SDKs in a mobile app, for example. So this is where the go to market and the technology, they're not divorced. They're part of the same thing, and that's what makes it the product.
But going back to the question around how specifically does BitLab assist the founders in the discovery process, because we've said that ideally, we can do the process ourselves. We're familiar with the process, but we want the founder to do it because ultimately it benefits them the most to understand their ICP, who they're selling to, what pain they're solving for. They have to sort of be in the trenches themselves with the troops and lead the charge, because that's how you win the battle. But how do we, as a software development studio coming in and developing the product, how do we assist the founder in the process? Do we provide scripts
We
or
provide
frameworks?
scripts.
Um, to help them with that?
Yes, we provide scripts and templates and kind of guidance towards how to conduct efficient discovery. But then the founder goes, does that, and then he comes back and he shares the insights, and then we kind of look at these insights jointly to figure out what does that mean for
Mhm.
the product? What does that mean for the roadmap?
Because based off that research, the code follows
And the design.
the market.
You started from the design. So based on the research, words on the page change, right? Because you just learned that ICP1 is better than ICP2, and you're tweaking your messaging around that on your landing page, for example. And then you might tweak the design, the UI, UX, because of how the prospects think about a problem. And then you change, and then eventually that kind of flows into the development side of things and testing. But ideally, we're trying to do this discovery more in the earlier stage before we get into development. So we're trying to get at least a month of discovery, a heavy month of discovery before we kick off development, because it means we're building now based on a much more stable foundation. Because it's always it, technology is expensive to change, and the more you build, the bigger the product becomes, the more expensive, and it's like it's the complexity, it's exponential, right? That you kind of, the more complex you make your product, the harder you make it to change the product. So think of this as steering a speedboat versus speeding Titanic. When you've built code for a year, now you're trying to steer Titanic in another direction, versus when you build code for a month, it's much faster to, you can navigate much easier.
Is there any are there any stories that we can share with our audience in regards to how BitLab pivoted a startup's product direction based on discovery
Oof,
findings?
I do have a lot of stories. Unfortunately, let me think, how do I share them? What can I share? So, in general, when we help founders, it's usually encouraging them to niche down. A lot of times, the founder is thinking, hey, I'm going to go and I'm going to capture the entire market. And I want to conquer
I'm
the
going to
world.
conquer
And
the
we're like,
world.
absolutely, you will conquer the world, but you can't try when you're starting out. You wanna try to conquer a small niche in the world when you're starting out, and then conquer the next niche, and then conquer another one, and then conquer another one. And it's what Peter Thiel calls the land and expand approach. What Facebook did when they rolled out Facebook is they conquered the first university and the second university and the third university, and then they went to your parents, and then they went to their parents, and then it became this huge thing. But it always started with a much more contained experiment or a contained niche. And there's a founder that we helped. Uh, Essentially, without sharing too much details, we helped them. They came to us and they wanted to tackle an it's a marketplace, so it's a marketplace startup, and they were trying to tackle an extremely broad market, which is literally every small business under the sun. And then we went from that to, oh, we found a very sweet sub niche that the founder themselves were actually an expert at. And initially we faced so much resistance. They're like, no, this is not the vision, this is not what we want to do, this is not. And then 2 months into that, they were like, oh my God, I'm so glad I did this, because I have no idea how I would have marketed to that much broader market. Even in the sub-market we carved out, they realized it's extremely freaking hard to get users. And so the narrower you become, the more uh, the more your messaging resonates, because now you're starting to talk in a language that your niche understands. And then you also need to know your strengths as a founder. And really, if you're trying to tackle a much broader niche beyond that, what you have exposure to, you have a ton of learning to do for every niche. There's every niche also uses like specific lingo, right? That is specific to that niche. If you come from if you come from a technology industry, you know what Scrum is, you know what Kanban is, you know what Java is. If you're an outsider, you have no idea. If you're a doctor, you know what an RX is, you know what an MRI is, and if you're not a doctor, you have no idea. If you're a realtor, you kind of like have certain terms that you use. So every industry, if you're in fintech, if you're a banker, you have terms you use. And so the broader your market, the broader the terms, and the less likely for people to convert. And then the more you narrow down, now you're starting to speak language that your prospects understand and can relate to, and they're like, oh, you get me. And that's what we're trying to do with your kind of market and your messaging and your solution itself. Is when somebody looks at it, they're like, oh, you get me.
And having a good grasp of the language and making it clear to them that you speak their language is absolutely vital. I remember for my previous company when I onboarded, something that I did was I created a glossary because it was in the space of environmental social governance and corporate social responsibility. They had their own different sets of terms, and I actually ended up like making a glossary of like 50 or 60 different um, words and their context, which ended up getting used for onboarding additional sales reps. And honestly, I think it's something that I should do again for BidLab. Now that I think about it, I don't think I have any sort of glossary. Um, it's very important to communicate to the prospect that you speak their language.
I like that. Sounds like a great content idea.
Do you want to cut it
Sure.
here?
It's good. It was a good discussion.